Now, there's an all-out attack on our freedoms currently being waged by Keir Starmer and this new Labour government, and the riots we've seen over recent weeks are the vehicle for their agenda. Brits are now being rounded up and arrested for things they've posted on social media in a chilling precedent that George Orwell...
We do have, of course, a special relationship with our friends in the UK and also with some of our European allies, but we also know that there have been infringements on free speech that actually affect not just the British. Of course, what the British do in their own country is up to them, but also affect American technology companies and by extension American citizens. So that is...
Keir Starmer thought he had everything under control until he didn't. A storm was brewing and he never saw it coming. It all started with a simple discussion about free speech.
Today at lunch.
We've had free speech for a very, very long time in the United Kingdom, and it will last for a very, very long time.
You don't agree with that?
Well, no, I mean, certainly we wouldn't want to reach across US citizens, and we don't, and that's absolutely right. But in relation to free speech in the UK, I'm very proud of our history there.
The UK prides itself on protecting freedom of expression, but when it comes to enforcing those values globally, things get complicated. Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, suddenly found himself at the centre of a controversy. His stance on free speech clashed with American tech giants and key political figures.
They want Elon Musk gone, X turned off, and freedom of speech stamped out. Starmer himself has said he's going to look at social media laws in the wake of the riots and even revisit the Online Safety Act. And right on cue, of course, the Westminster elite are now circling. Guardian columnists got their knickers in a twist, saying Musk should be on trial in the UK for inciting...
Then, across the Atlantic, Donald Trump and Vance spotted an opening. They didn't hold back, slamming Starmer's approach to international relations, especially when it came to US interests. Trump went straight for the jugular, exposing flaws in Starmer's policies. Vance followed suit, calling for stronger leadership in the UK. This wasn't just political posturing, it was a direct attack, and Starmer wasn't ready for it. As the criticism piled on, his team scrambled to control the damage, but the cracks were already showing. And the worst part, this was only the beginning.
...the riots. And Keir Starmer's champagne socialist biographer, Tom Baldwin, called for regulation of social media platforms, even saying free speech was not absolute. Make no mistake, the minority racist idiots who caused the worst of these riots have opened the floodgates for a power grab of our civil liberties under this Labour government. And it's a crying shame that it's a US-based South African who's the only one with the balls to stick up for British citizens.
Keir Starmer's handling of free speech policies wasn't just stirring controversy at home, it was making waves internationally. As Labour leader, he had long supported tighter regulations, but his stance on global free speech, particularly regarding American tech companies, was raising alarms.
News now, and a woman has been arrested by Cheshire Police in relation to an inaccurate information on social media about the attacker in the Southport murders.
A woman arrested.
These tech giants don't just influence the UK, their reach is worldwide. Many fear that growing government and corporate control over public discourse is happening with little accountability. Starmer's push for stricter regulations put him at odds, not only with these companies, but also with powerful American backers.
It's to silence concerns of mass uncontrolled migration by stamping out free speech. Starmer is now targeting people for their online chatterings and sending the police to arrest them.
What started as a domestic issue quickly turned into an international political flashpoint. US politicians weighed in, warning that Starmer's policies wouldn't just affect Britain, they had real consequences for American citizens too. And that was all the invitation Trump needed to go after Starmer. His policies weren't just a UK problem anymore. They had crossed the Atlantic, and now he had a fight on his hands he wasn't prepared for.
And we do have dedicated police officers who are scouring social media. Their job is to look for this material. And then follow up with identification arrests and so forth.
Free speech crackdowns weren't just affecting Brits, they were hitting American tech firms and, by extension, US citizens. And Donald Trump wasn't about to let that slide. He came out swinging, calling Starmer weak on international relations and a threat to American interest. According to Trump, Starmer's lack of global awareness wasn't just bad for Britain, it was bad for the US too.
Media posts. Today, some other people have been given whopping great big terms in prison for social media posts. Now, I want to make it clear that those people sent to prison so far did say some vile things online. And given the context of everything going on, many people will think that they deserve prison. But some people are making the point that there were members of grooming gangs who have received lesser prison sentences. But I am worried about where we're...
But Trump wasn't the only one taking aim. JD Vance doubled down, tearing into Starmer's diplomatic failures. Known for his blunt takes, Vance didn't sugarcoat it. He called Starmer's leadership naive, especially when dealing with major powers like the US and China. Vance didn't just question Starmer's handling of free speech, he questioned whether the Labour leader had what it took to represent Britain on the world stage. In his eyes, Starmer wasn't just weak, he was a liability.
Be clear about this. It's not protest, it's not legitimate, it's crime. Violent disorder, an assault on the rule of law and the execution of justice.
And in the brutal world of politics, weak leaders don't last long. Keir Starmer wants to be seen as a pragmatic leader, someone who handles diplomacy behind closed doors. His strategy? Staying quiet in public. But silence isn't strength, it's weakness. Trump and JD Vance's attacks weren't just passing comments, they sparked a full-blown crisis for Starmer. The UK media ran with the story, and soon it wasn't just two American politicians criticising him, everyone had an opinion.
Inciting criminality. The far right does exist, they need to be dealt with, but my concern is this. Instead of dealing with immigration and illegal immigration, this Labour government will introduce very, very subjective and draconian laws to scare people into silence.
Starmer's leadership, once seen as steady, was now under fire from all sides. The backlash wasn't just external, it was creeping into his own party. Behind closed doors, Labour MPs started asking the uncomfortable question, was Starmer strong enough to lead?
Groups involved in riots across Britain if it wasn't for Musk and X. Musk has goaded Starmer online, calling him a hypocrite over his alleged two-tier approach to the riots, while also suggesting the PM is overseeing a Soviet-style administration. In response, the highest police officer in the land seemed to bizarrely hint that Mr. Musk could be extradited to Britain to explain himself.
The press smelled blood. His responses to the controversy were weak, his speeches uninspiring. Instead of turning the tide, Starmer's attempts to reassure the public only made things worse. Headlines were brutal, the polls weren't any kinder, public confidence was slipping fast, and the more Starmer tried to control the narrative, the more it spun out of his grasp. His leadership was on the ropes, and things were about to get even worse.
There's a sort of silly argument sometimes about free speech, and Musk is sort of trying to pretend sort of freedom of speech is some absolute right. It's never been an absolute right. And we have regulation. The BBC is regulated. I think the BBC is better for being regulated. I don't think we have enough regulation in the press. I think the press is worse for not being regulated. Social media is just another form of media, and for too long, people in that sort of internet world, this whole idea of freedom of the internet, they've thought that sort of somehow that this great technological change can go through without touching the sides of democracy. I think democracy needs to sort of reinsert itself.
Yeah. I have another theory about Musk. I don't think he's interfering in democracy in the UK. I think he's electioneering in the US election. He's just practicing.
Desperate to regain control, Keir Starmer took to the stage. This was his chance to reset the narrative, to prove he could handle the pressure. But when the moment came, he fumbled. His speech, carefully crafted to reassure the public and the press, fell flat. Instead of projecting strength, Starmer spoke in vague generalities, offering empty promises without real solutions. He failed to address the growing backlash over free speech, or the criticism from Trump and JD Vance. This wasn't the decisive leadership people were hoping for. It was damage control without conviction.
I was talking with a friend recently, and we were talking about, one of the big dangers in the world, of course, is nuclear proliferation, though, of course, the Biden administration doesn't care about it. And I was talking about, what is the first truly Islamist country that will get a nuclear weapon? And we were like, maybe it's Iran, maybe Pakistan already kind of counts. And then we sort of finally decided maybe it's actually the UK, since Labour just took over. But to my Tory friends, I have to say, you guys have got to get a handle on this, but neither here nor there.
The press saw right through it. Headlines slammed his weak response and public sentiment soured even further. Instead of calming the storm, Starmer's speech only fueled doubts about his ability to lead, and behind the scenes the murmurs within Labour grew louder. Was Starmer losing his grip on the party? Was it time to start looking for a new leader? The cracks in his leadership were turning into full-blown fractures. Behind closed doors, Labour MPs weren't just whispering anymore. They were having serious discussions about Keir Starmer's future.
This is an important part of it. The president knows that, look, if you want real security guarantees, if you want to actually ensure that Vladimir Putin does not invade Ukraine again, the very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. That is a way better security guarantee than 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years.
Trump and J.D. Vance may have sparked the fire, but it was Starmer's weak response that let it spread. He couldn't regain control of the narrative, and that failure shook confidence in his leadership. Private meetings were held. Starmer's closest allies, once unwavering in their support, started having second thoughts. Senior Labour figures questioned whether he had the political instincts or strength to lead the party through this crisis.
British Prime Minister Keir Starmer will host Ukrainian President Zelensky at Downing Street in just a few hours' time. The Ukrainian delegation is now in London after flying in from the US. This was the moment plane touched down ahead of tomorrow's meeting of European leaders in London for that security summit. Meeting between the two leaders follows President Zelensky's clash, of course, with President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance in the Oval Office yesterday. President Trump accused the Ukrainian leader of gambling with World War III and of not being grateful for the support of the US. President Zelensky made it clear there should be no compromises with President Putin. Following those exchanges, the president of Ukraine was ordered to leave the White House. The American minerals deal was not signed. The US president later said President Zelensky could return when he was ready for peace.
The concern wasn't just about free speech. It was about Starmer's ability to stand firm on any major issue. If he couldn't handle international pressure now, what would happen in a real political showdown? One question was hanging in the air. How much longer could Labour stand by a leader who seemed incapable of leading? And as speculation about his replacement grew, so did the feeling that Starmer's time was running out.
I said what I said, which is that we do have, of course, a special relationship with our friends in the UK and also with some of our European allies, but we also know that there have been infringements on free speech that actually affect not just the British, of course, what the British do in their own country is up to them, but also affect American technology companies and by extension American citizens. So that is.
And in the brutal world of politics, weak leaders don't last long. Keir Starmer wants to be seen as a pragmatic leader, someone who handles diplomacy behind closed doors. His strategy? Staying quiet in public. But silence isn't strength, it's weakness. Trump and J.D. Vance's attacks weren't just passing comments, they sparked a full-blown crisis for Starmer. The UK media ran with the story, and soon it wasn't just two American politicians criticising him, everyone had an opinion.
Inciting criminality. The far right does exist, they need to be dealt with, but my concern is this. Instead of dealing with immigration and illegal immigration, this Labour government will introduce very subjective and draconian laws to scare people into silence.
Starmer's leadership, once seen as steady, was now under fire from all sides. The backlash wasn't just external, it was creeping into his own party. Behind closed doors, Labour MPs started asking the uncomfortable question: was Starmer strong enough to lead?
Groups involved in riots across Britain if it wasn't for Musk and X. Musk has goaded Starmer online, calling him a hypocrite over his alleged two-tier approach to the riots, while also suggesting the PM is overseeing a Soviet-style administration. In response, the highest police officer in the land seemed to bizarrely hint that Mr. Musk could be extradited to Britain to explain himself.
The press smelled blood. His responses to the controversy were weak, his speeches uninspiring. Instead of turning the tide, Starmer's attempts to reassure the public only made things worse. Headlines were brutal, the polls weren't any kinder, public confidence was slipping fast, and the more Starmer tried to control the narrative, the more it spun out of his grasp. His leadership was on the ropes, and things were about to get even worse. But Trump wasn't the only one taking aim. J.D. Vance doubled down, tearing into Starmer's diplomatic failures. Known for his blunt takes, Vance didn't sugarcoat it. He called Starmer's leadership naive, especially when dealing with Keir Starmer's leadership is hanging by a thread. Doubts are growing inside and outside the Labour Party, and the pressure isn't letting up. Can he turn things around, or is his time as leader coming to an end? Drop a comment below. What's next for Starmer and Labour? And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe.